Good morning, everyone. So I have the task of opening the ceremony to this third Bartha and Maria Knoppers annual lecture. People that know me know that I like to keep these speeches short, and I will do that. I do want to say, first of all, that I'm very grateful because we have today Dean Fellows from the Faculty of Medicine that took the time to join us, and that's really nice. We have also the chair of the Department of Human Genetics, Dr. Will Folks, here with us. Many illustrious guests from overseas as well, so we're very grateful to have everybody with us this morning. The talk is co-organized by the Center of Genomics and Policy here at McGill University and from the Department of Human Genetics. And I'll say just a few words about the Center of Genomics and Policy. It was funded by Dr. Bartha Maria Knoppers. We installed ourselves at McGill in 2009. And since then, we've been really a center dedicated to investigate the ethical, legal, and social issues that are raised by development in human genomics and all the associated scientific branches. And I want to say that what we're really known for, and there's no center like this one, I would say worldwide, is really the multidisciplinarity and the international comparative research. It's been a strength of ours for many, many years, and we have an international reputation for that. And we're going to continue that tradition because this morning, our speaker, Professor Calvin O, is one of those best international legal comparatists that I know. And we're in for a fantastic talk. And on that note, I'll let my friend and colleague, Professor Zawadi, introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Professor Joly. Dear colleagues, dear friends, my name is Man Zawati. I'm the Research Director of the CGP. Welcome. We're also welcoming you to the Senate grounds of McGill University. This is where we have our meetings. This lecture series was established to recognize and perpetuate the extraordinary contributions of Professor Bartha Maria Knoppers. Her pioneering work has profoundly shaped the field of health law, bioethics, and genomics policy, always guided by the fundamental principles of innovation and human rights. And we are honored and privileged to have you with us today. Each year, this lecture brings to the fore a distinguished voice whose work resonates with the vision embodied by Professor Knoppers. And this morning we are honored to welcome Dr. Calvin Ho. He's an associate professor with the Faculty of Law at Monash University in Melbourne. He's a research fellow of the Center for Medical Ethics at the University of Hong Kong, a fellow of the Public Health Genomics Foundation at the University of Cambridge, and also newly an associate member of the Center of Genomics and Policy. His research spans global health law and ethics, and the governance of emerging biomedical and health technologies with a particular focus on artificial intelligence and data analytics. Beyond academia, Dr. Ho's expertise is sought on the international stage. He serves as co-chair of the World Health Organization's expert group on the ethics of social listening and infodemic management, and he's also a member of the WHO COVID-19 Ethics and Governance Working Group. He's also an ethics board member of Médecins Sans Frontières, and contributes to the regulatory and ethics workstream of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Dr. Ho's distinguished career exemplifies the spirit of this lecture, rigorous scholarship, ethical leadership, and global engagement. It is therefore with great pleasure that I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Calvin Ho.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Professor Zawati. Good morning, Dean Fellows, Professor Knoppers, Professor Joly, Professor Zawati, colleagues, friends. Please let me first begin by expressing my deep gratitude for this wonderful opportunity. So when Jan asked if I would deliver the annual Professor Bartha K. Knoppers lecture, I mentioned to Jan, perhaps you may want to consider a more senior figure. I truly cannot measure up to the stature of previous speakers like Eric Maslin, who has been a monumental figure in bioethics. But I thought I'll seize the opportunity nonetheless, because I'd like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude and thanks to Professor Knoppers, to celebrate her work. She has been an inspiration and a mentor for well over 10 years. From the time I started out at bioethics, so that was more than 10 years ago when I was working with the Ministry of Health in Singapore, Professor Knoppers, along with Professor Martin Bolbro, Dr. Thomas Murray, and Professor Bernard Lowell, they were the international expert advisors to the Bioethics Advisory Committee, which is the National Bioethics Committee of Singapore. And I've long admired Professor Knoppers' work. I've learned how she brought policy, how academic, intellectual work translated into the policy domain, and how she intermediated among leading scientists in the world. One of my bosses at that time, the late Professor Sidney Brenner, well known for his Nobel Prize-winning work in programmed cell death, but of course, he's a person with many deep insights on the relationship between science and society, and many, many other leading researchers of the time. So, so she has truly been a mentor in more ways than one. So thank you so much, Professor Knoppers. So I hope I do justice today in revisiting some of your work and in illustration of how it has impacted my own thinking and my own work. So, so some of the key messages today, I'd like to highlight some of the commitments that are demonstrated in Professor Knoppers' work. You see that there is a very strong focus on advocacy for epistemic plurality. I'll mention more about this. It's deeply rooted in epistemic justice, how we know what we know, and whether this is in keeping with the principle of justice. Her commitment to fundamental human rights and how she has revitalized the human right to science, which has been dormant for various reasons, some of which I will revisit today. Her commitment to multilateralism the world is in great need of at this point, and I think this message should again be articulated and highlighted. I'd like to draw on these various commitments and to discuss how we could perhaps think through the challenges in the potential application of polygenic risk scores, especially involving the use of AI medical devices. So if we think about large data sets, complex analysis, and of course, both at the phenotypic and genomic levels, it will involve machine learning, and it will involve AI to varying degrees. And Professor Knoppers has again been among the first scholars in the field of bioethics to highlight the concerns and highlight some of the issues that we should start thinking about, and to think how we could potentially harness on this capability while remaining committed to some of these fundamental principles and values. In the last segment of my talk, I have been based in Hong Kong, and I remain involved in a number of developments in Hong Kong. And I thought that I want to think about how Professor Knoppers and also, of course, tap on this opportunity to draw on her thoughts on what we could consider in terms of policy development in Hong Kong, in the medical space. And also, of course, I forget to mention, I am on the Ethics Advisory Committee of the Hong Kong Genome Institute. And so prior to this particular meeting, there has been an opportunity to discuss with colleagues at the Hong Kong Genome Institute and how we could perhaps steer policy forward in, to varying degrees, mainstreaming genomic technology in healthcare, and also importantly to render more accessible interventions, innovative interventions, especially where rare diseases are concerned. So with this, I shall begin with the session proper, starting with epistemic plurality and justice. So why is it so important to think about epistemic justice and epistemic plurality? Meaning, why can we not just simply rely on the hard sciences as it were. Now, the reason, of course, and I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that genetics or genomics has had a dark history to begin with. If we are to simply apply science as it is without bringing in normative considerations, then we will, again, be faced with many challenges of a human rights nature and, of course, many of the other normative challenges. And here, of course, I'm referring to eugenics. So this was not too long ago. It was in 1902, as you would see. And of course, there were proponents of genomics in the US, and this would have been, of course, in the neighboring country to Canada. You'd see that there's been an attempt to draw on scientific knowledge and to apply it as social policy. And of course, we have had a rather infamous decision that came from the US Supreme Court in Buck and Bell. Of course, this was on forced sterilization of people with mental disability. Of course, at that time, it was felt to be a good thing. So Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, noted for many of his other contributions, made this rather controversial statement. Of course, thankfully, since that time, the decision has been distinguished to almost non-existence by the US Supreme Court. So starting with the subsequent US Supreme Court decision in Skinner and Oklahoma. So although not directly overturned by subsequent decisions, it is no longer applied, and of course there are due process checks under the 14th Amendment that's considered to apply in these sorts of cases. But I think it's a helpful reminder to think about why there is this need to draw on human rights and to draw on normative considerations even as we engage with scientific technology. I want to highlight this particular episode because it explains why, although the human right to science was introduced early on in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it fell into silence partly because of this episode. This attempt to apply eugenics as social policy, which led to a regress, a pulling back in terms of applying science beyond, of course, what would be non-scientific domains. And so, why are we thinking about this at this time? Because the concerns remain with us. We now have the technological capability in genomics to make fundamental changes to who we are fundamentally as individuals. So CRISPR, of course, is just illustrative of the technological capability that we now have. So the sort of eugenic concerns that we had in 1902 is still very much with us. It may not be as explicit, there might be some implicit thinking, but they need to be subject to normative checks. They need to be subject to human rights considerations and constraints. So, of course, not too long ago, of course, that happened in Hong Kong. There was the announcement of the 3 CRISPR babies, as you know. So this, again, highlights what some of the challenges that will be linked to this particular technology. And, of course, we're not quite done away with this concern because the wife or ex-wife has recently, of Dr. He Jiankui, continues with this particular eugenic endeavor in in the use of gene editing technologies, well, again, across the border from here, or so I understand. So that's part of innovation as we understand it and subject to very limited checks that are in place. So the concern is still very much with us. I just wanted to start off by highlighting why there is even greater need to draw on some of these principles, to draw on the works that Professor Knoppers has developed over the years, and to say that it remains highly relevant today, perhaps all the more so, given our capabilities and given some of the challenges that we still have. So Professor Knoppers has been very much involved in contributing to the normative thinking in this particular space. Of course, in response to the gene editing challenge, there's been a number of international documents in place, international frameworks, and I will explain in the course of this session how Professor Knoppers' work through various organizations have contributed to the norm formation in response to this technological know-how. One of the important contributions of Professor Knoppers is in the thinking around anticipatory governance. So in response to this particular technological capability, the way that we administer ethical principles, legal principles, can't be business as usual. There needs to be a rethinking of how we approach and engage with technology. We need to think seriously about co-production, and therefore it brings us back to this notion of epistemic plurality and epistemic justice. And we need to think about what regulators should do and how they need to be capacitated to do this sort of work well. And again, I'm reminded of my time with the Ministry of Health in Singapore, and of course how Professor Knoppers has encouraged policymakers there to think in an anticipatory way and to engage with some of these developments in terms of some very practical policy tools and also in terms of the frameworks. So we will be looking at some of these, but I just wanted to highlight here anticipatory governance as a concept, and just wanted to share another project. So this was a chapter that I did with colleagues who have also drawn inspiration from Professor Knoppers' work, so Graham Laurie, Ted Dove, and other colleagues. Of course, this is in drawing on this notion of anticipatory governance in the AI space and learning health systems. So a bit more on that later, but again, a few more slides to highlight why this technology is bringing on new challenges, CRISPR and related technologies. My colleague from Australia, Ainsley, is an expert in this domain. So when we think about mitochondrial transfer, mitochondrial donation, of course, that continues to be a key challenge in thinking about what is the significant harm threshold and when can this particular technology be appropriately applied. And at the somatic level, we, of course, already have gene therapies in place, importantly in the UK, illustrative of a particular, one could argue, anticipatory governance sort of approach. We have this new intervention being on the market to address sickle cell anemia. So some very important changes. But then, of course, I just want to highlight here at this stage that while we have the technological capabilities, I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in terms of our regulatory response and also in terms of our ethical mechanisms and frameworks. So a lot more thinking needs to go into this space in moving forward with how we could respond better to some of these developments. So I want to return to what a rights-based approach is going to be like. So drawing on human rights and again, picking up on one of the very important contributions of Professor Knoppers, and that's the reinvigoration of the human right to science. So what exactly does that mean? So we are reminded through Professor Knoppers' work that science is fundamentally a humanistic enterprise. So it cannot be dissociated from what we are fundamentally as humans, and of course with that our strengths and limitations. And of course when we think about the human right to science, it is just one human right in the totality of rights. So we cannot just simply apply the human right to science without also thinking about related human rights. So that is a way of drawing on one particular normative requirement and using that to bridge and to bring in some of these other normative expectations in supporting technological development and application. So, and of course with that, there would be other rights and liberties or freedoms to consider. Well, drawing on Eric's work, so Eric got us thinking some time ago about what research means. I just thought that that it would be good to think about where we started and how Eric has helped us think through the complexification of science and scientific enterprise, reflected in UNESCO's more recent document in 2017. As you see here, there's an expansive definition of science and technology, but it's not very clear how the norms would fit in and where ethics sit in it all. So one could argue that all the more there's a need to bring in the human right to science, bring in ethical thinking to support a form of co-production that is equivalent to epistemic plurality in a true sense. And of course, this is consistent with epistemic justice in my view, because it ensures that there is diversity of perspective. It keeps in check any sort of dominant viewpoint. Not that there's anything problematic per se about it, but then of course, these sort of checks is the best safeguards against any sort of heretic thinking that might emerge as a consequence, as we've seen around eugenics. So in thinking about human right to science, what exactly is it? So these are some of the core aspects that I thought might be useful to highlight. Again, I want to make clear what Professor Knoppers has done in terms of the thinking in this domain. So for those who are new to human rights law, international human rights law, there are three important documents to note. Of course, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that would set out in its basic form the human right to science along with the other human rights. And then there are two international covenants that give expression to some of these rights. So there would be the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or ICESCR in short. So it's in the ICESCR that gives more expression, and it elaborates on the human right to science, and drawing on a number of developments since that time, and a revisiting of this particular concept of the human right to science, Professor Knoppers, along with other colleagues, have highlighted a number of important aspects that's linked to anticipatory governance, and to think about how science as a knowledge field should be interacting with the normative domains. And of course here, in practical terms, it speaks to the need to create an enabling environment. And of course, this speaks directly to the role of policymakers and regulators. So what exactly should policymakers do? They need to create an enabling environment that could draw together in a responsible and sensible way what would be science, and also what would be considerations in the normative domain. And of course, in subsequent works, this does not just simply come about. It requires clear policy framework, clear bridges that, would draw and give expression to a number of these principles. And of course, this is still in keeping with some of the core elements within international human rights law. It remains committed to progressive realization based on maximum available resources, and importantly, non-retrogression. So these are some of the core elements that would be required, and one could argue that all countries in the world have committed to in different ways. This would be, of course, the important work that Professor Knoppers and colleagues have done. If you are interested to look into the arguments that Professor Knoppers and colleagues have highlighted in creating this enabling environment, and of course linked to anticipatory governance, you're very welcome to look at this particular work. I wanted to say that this is also important because, as I've mentioned earlier, the human right to science is not a standalone right. It is linked to all of the other human rights. So although there are the two international covenants often seen as very different in substantive character, but one could also argue that the normative expectations are interchangeable. So by looking at the human right to science, we are also in different ways giving expression to the other human rights. And this is illustrated in a decision that has been handed down by the Supreme Court of Victoria in Australia. So interestingly enough, this was about whether a woman who has been incarcerated in prison for a criminal offense could continue to have access to ART. And there's a need for access to happen at that particular point in time because she was basically at the age limit. So beyond a particular age, then ART would not be very helpful to her. So the Supreme Court of Victoria held that although the Victoria Charter on Human Rights and Responsibility Act did not make explicit reference to the human right to health or human right to health care, by drawing on other human rights principles, there was implicit in these rights the human right to health, and therefore a drawing in of this particular right, even though it was not mentioned explicitly within that framework. So this is just illustrative of how one particular human right could lead to the protection of other rights in constituting an enabling environment that could help promote and support health and human flourishing. So apart from this, of course, it also draws on the Syracuse principles. So this would be international law principles that requires policymakers and regulators to consider when and to what extent fundamental human rights could be restricted. So, of course, there are limitations, as we've seen in the recent COVID-19 pandemic, but I do think that in reinvigorating the human right to science, there are at least these two potentials that have been brought in and that could enrich normative thinking in terms of the roles and responsibilities of regulators and policymakers. So linked to this notion of anticipatory governance, colleagues who have worked very closely with Professor Knoppers have developed other related concepts such as anticipatory duties. So we will be having a meeting in Cambridge next year on anticipatory duties and on what Rumi would call preventive duties, so under the international law and international human rights framework, and how this could impact on regulation of science and scientific innovation. So this is, again, just one example of a development that follows from Professor Knoppers' rich work. Of course, we also see from that time it's linked to a number of other important international law documents. The Oviedo Convention is one of them that reflects some thinking around anticipatory governance, anticipatory duties, as well as preventive duties, as well as, of course, many of the UNESCO's declarations. Again, I mention these documents because, again, it shows how fundamental human rights is. And in the next segment of my discussion, I'd like to draw that link between human rights and the very enriched environment that Professor Knoppers has created, and how that particular environment has supported the development of broader ethical and legal norms. So one could also argue, to a degree, social norms as well. So this is just for completeness. You're welcome to look at this at your own time. Sorry about this being rather wordy, but it's just to highlight some of the contributions of human rights in this particular space. So having considered the human rights framework and the important contributions that Professor Knoppers has made in this space, human rights is, I would argue, the fundamental bedrock of multilateralism. And this, again, is wonderfully reflected in Professor Knoppers' work, particularly in her application of comparative law and policy. So one of the other colleagues who has worked for a long time, our colleague Rosie, who has been working with Professor Knoppers, illustrative of how comparative law could contribute to norm formation and multilateralism. And importantly, it's the sort of bottom-up approach that I think is important. In international law, we still have to deal with some of the constraints of sovereignty and the doctrine of sovereignty, which is basically the way that we think about international law. But Professor Knoppers has, through Hugo, through the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, illustrated how a bottom-up approach could be adopted, working with sovereignty, but involving private actors in supporting what would be responsible development of science. So I make reference, of course, to Professor Knoppers' important work with the Hugo International Ethics Committee. So in thinking about, of course, that would have been some time ago in relative terms. So in thinking about all the important articulation of the principles, again, drawing from fundamental human rights commitments, how it has contributed to various statements on stem cells, on genomics, in terms of what ethics review should be looking out for, and how science should be interacting with society at a normative level. So these are just illustrative of some of the developments there. And of course, when we think about comparative law and policy, this is again a publication of Professor Knoppers with former colleague Rosie, illustrative of how comparative law methods could be applied not only to show how norms could come about in this particular domain, but again illustrative of the sort of bottom-up multilateralism that's supported by the very innovative work that Professor Knoppers has put in place. So if we think about creating international norms, it's not just a matter of governments meeting together and articulating what should be done. We see that there's a very organic interaction and a very dynamic one that's in place. And this, I think, is wonderfully, excuse me, I keep hitting, sorry about that. It's wonderfully illustrated in Professor Knoppers' very rich work. So you'd find that it's not simply top-down. It draws on a number of private actors, and of course Hugo is illustrative of that, where researchers, scientists themselves are directly involved in the process of norm formation, collaboratively with governments, with international governmental organizations, and other organizations like the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, another important organization that has benefited from Professor Knoppers' expertise. So it would be true, drawing on her insights on human rights, the reinvigoration of the human right to science, and exploring and examining, giving animation to other human rights commitments, as well as through very practical approaches. For lawyers in the room, you'd be familiar with comparative law, how that could directly contribute to norm formation in private domains, in international domains, and in liminal spaces where these two domains intersect. So the framework for responsible sharing of genomic and health-related data is just illustrative of this sort of bottom-up norm formation with huge repercussions, not just, of course, the way that science is being done by private actors, scientific institutions as private institutions, but also where governments and policymakers are concerned. So it's in a way quite similar to the ICH GCP, the good clinical practice, but different because of the approach very special approach, unique approach that Professor Knoppers has made possible through her work. And I think that there is great need to think about these sort of approaches in the geopolitical context of today. So there is as we see in the world, a retreat from multilateralism. So we need to think again about how best to bring together collective concerns, collective goods, public interest, and reconcile it with an increasingly pronounced emphasis on national security. So how to draw the two together in a sensible way and in a way that promotes global multilateralism is one of the key challenges, and I think some of the experiences that we've seen in the past could find application today, but of course with some fresh insights and applications. We have also seen, again, from this particular approach, the articulation of new standards. Of course, here, in terms of introducing greater diversity to human genetic studies, is just, again, one of the positive externalities, so to speak, of Professor Knoppers' excellent work. And of course, this is, again, in the context of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. So what we have done so far would be to consider why there is a need for normative thinking, human rights in particular, with emphasis on the rather dark history that we started off with in the attempt to apply genetic knowledge or scientific knowledge as it is in the social domain. And we've seen some of the very difficult challenges that have arisen during the Second World War and the reaction to that, as well as the continuing relevance given the very important technological changes that we've seen today, notably CRISPR. We have revisited, and also drawing on Professor Knoppers' important work, why human rights and the human rights framework remains core to some of these developments, because it reminds us of who we are, some of the limitations as humans that we need to continue to recognize, engage with, and some of the fundamental commitments that we need to have, and we have made, but arguably we need to give stronger voice to, given, thank you, a number of these challenges. So that would be in human rights, and how human rights has in turn, drawing inspiration from Professor Knoppers' work, led to thinking around ethical as well as legal requirements, as well as multilateralism from the bottom up, as it were. So for all of these various developments, I'd like to now look into a recent development, and again, as I've mentioned at the start of the session itself, Professor Knoppers was among the first scholars to draw the attention of the bioethics and scientific community to think about some of the ethical concerns that could arise and why we need to, again, think seriously about the implications. Polygenic risk score, so here's the definition. I've benefited from PhD Foundation's excellent report on the topic. So you see that this is a very helpful definition that highlights the complexity of this particular capability, which can be very useful in terms of advancing healthcare in a personalized and arguably predictive way. And so if we were to look at some of the studies that have followed on in this particular space, the Ada Lovelace Institute, as well as the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, have recently published 2 reports on the use of such scores in healthcare. And this document has been very helpful in terms of highlighting the applications. We're going to focus on where the arrow points to. And these are, of course, linked to, as we shall see, the ability to personalize healthcare, as well as some of the preventive roles that these applications could have. And again here, in terms of polygenic analysis and scoring, you see here linked to diagnosis and prediction of complex traits. So in broad summary, in terms of the capability, very nicely summarized as personalization, that this particular capability could confer on healthcare, as well as greater and more precise predictive ability. But I thought what's helpful is that in these reports, Nuffield Council and Ada Lovelace Institute highlighted that it's not time yet, because in the context of the UK, we do not at this time have an enabling environment, going back to the language that Professor Knoppers has used. No enabling environment, and there is a shortfall in the know-how. How do we respond? How do we govern this particular space in a way that could prevent harm, and in an approach that's consistent with anticipatory governance? So in terms of what has been highlighted in the report itself, it sets out what needs to be done. And as you see, these are essentially environmental concerns in terms of what needs to be done, what needs to be put in place in order to, as a society in the UK, allow the use of these sorts of technologies. And again, I thought, at least for me, it would remind myself, and hopefully yourselves as well, of what Professor Knoppers has highlighted earlier in thinking about what an enabling environment should look like and how it could give expression to human rights concerns. Because implicit to a number of these concerns, including the transparency requirement, these are fundamental human rights commitments. Of course, transparency is a very basic requirement in the human right to health, and also many other human rights, including the right to information. So the supportive regimes are not quite here. Again, just illustrative, I've worked with colleagues to think about this space, drawing on Professor Knoppers' work, and this was in a special issue of the WHO Bulletin. So if you're interested, it would be good to have a look at this and its implications in health insurance, for example. But in having seen the normative environment and also in terms of the technological capabilities as well as challenges, here are some of my thoughts in terms of what I think could happen in Hong Kong. So I was based in Hong Kong prior to moving to Australia, and of course, Hong Kong and the southern province of China remains a research focus of mine. And I can't speak to developments in Canada. I'd love to hear about comparative developments. But here are some of the thoughts, again, drawing on Professor Knoppers' work, some of the developments that I think should follow. My sense is that for a jurisdiction like Hong Kong remains a special administrative region, so separate from mainland China. It is committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is also committed to the two international covenants. So what it needs to do, of course, is to have policies that would be consistent with national security requirements where applicable with mainland China, but the expectation, in my view, is not for Hong Kong to be exactly the same as mainland China. And that is not, in my view, the way to go. Instead, what Hong Kong needs to do is to intermediate between what would be the Chinese regime, Chinese technological space with the rest of the world. And this intermediation could only happen if there are in place particular policy frameworks and infrastructures drawing on some of Professor Knoppers' work. So the comparator, in my mind, would be the construction of what, under the EU AI Act, would be equivalent to a regulatory sandbox in order to test the real-world implementation of capabilities like polygenic risk scores. Another approach, of course, would be to put in place real-world testing and data. Of course, this requires specific regimes. It does not automatically happen. Now, this is a complex space to navigate because we are talking about developing governance capabilities, drawing on anticipatory governance, that involves, at least in the Greater Bay Area of China, involving at least 3 jurisdictions: mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau. So these are 3 very different jurisdictions with different normative requirements, but then all committed in different ways to fundamental human rights requirements. Or they should be, certainly at a formalistic level. So there would be that commitment, and we find that in Hong Kong there has been various initiatives to give expression to these commitments, but more through soft law means. So no hard law developments at this particular time, but I think it's a promising development. So in terms of how Hong Kong is positioning itself as an intermediary between what would be the Chinese technological domain and developments in the rest of the world, you'd find, in thinking about the AI applications where it's linked to polygenic risk scores, a number of important thinking around the human-in-the-loop kind of concept and related kind of AI applications, as well as in thinking about governance regimes that could follow, and also a creation of a data space starting with the electronic health record system. Of course, the key challenge now would be to link up what would be electronic health record system in Hong Kong with, of course, what would be in the southern province of Canton or Guangdong province, and of course in Macau as well. As I've mentioned, I think human rights is a useful platform to think about what on mainland China has been highlighted as AI safety. I think it's without question that all governments around the world, while keen to promote this particular technological capability, would be mindful of public health challenges in terms of both safety and effectiveness aspects. And all governments in the world are actively, particularly those committed to these technological capabilities, are putting in place policies and practices and standards to respond to this challenge. And I think it's heartening to see that although there's been a pulling away from multilateralism, there's still rather strong collaboration in this space. And I think this should continue to be supported. So it's just for completeness a highlight of the sort of emphasis that we see on mainland China and how this could be taken forward by, again, drawing on some aspects of human rights thinking as well as thinking on ethics and law. I haven't got the time to go into detail in terms of how this could be taken on, but I invite you to look at Professor Knoppers' immense work. And her body of work could speak to or could point us to a way forward. Of course, then there is also that need to bridge what would be a regulatory divide between AI devices on the one hand and data governance on the other. It is not easy to think about how these two frameworks could come together in a sensible way in order to support the sort of polygenic, AI-based polygenic risk score that could be applied. So for example, this is just illustrative of mainland China. So whereas in Hong Kong, there is essentially just one regime, a rather old one that will need to be revisited soon on privacy. On mainland China, there would be a whole series of legislations that will need to be worked through. And of course, there is also going to be a need to think about how AI as medical devices should be regulated. And I highlight this participatory element because we had a meeting not too long ago at Fondation Brochet, just outside of Geneva, because Professor Knoppers is one of the key conveners, together with Samantha Besson. And this particular notion, as well as a related publication from there, is illustrative again of drawing on the human right to science and how it could contribute to thinking of regulation of medical devices in a way that could help bridge that divide between devices on the one hand and data on the other. So there's quite a bit going on there, but I think I'm almost at time. So in conclusion, just some very broad discussion, which I hope we'll have time to take up in Q&A, some of these elements. Some of the very important contributions that we've seen and we could draw on from Professor Knoppers' work, starting with a recognition of some of the difficulties that technology could present, but at the same time, great potential that technology offers. According to Dewey, in legal pragmatism and other pragmatic thoughts, right? Scientific knowledge is one of the most important developments that perhaps could be linked to human development of our generations. So, however, of course, what he did not say and what would be implicit in this particular notion is that scientific knowledge itself is not a standalone knowledge. And as a matter of epistemic justice, we do need to recognize other forms of knowledge, especially in the normative domain. And here we have seen how human rights and human rights commitment is foundational to all of these various initiatives and also fundamentally the scientific endeavor itself. We have seen how human rights itself has led to the shaping of other ethical as well as legal developments. It's not to say that it's the only contributor, but of course it's one of the main contributors in terms of thinking in this particular domain, and how this particular thought is so very important today given the sort of technological capabilities and challenges that we have. And I've just very briefly illustrated what this could mean in relation to polygenic risk scores. It's up and coming, just highlighting that we do not have that sort of environment. We have the technological capability, but not the environment in order to use this capability responsibly. So that's the sort of work that we need to do. And for colleagues who are in Hong Kong and also whom I've been in discussion with, I do think that it's an opportunity to think about how Hong Kong itself could play a very major role in developing this space, given its very unique history and situation. So with this, thank you so much again for this wonderful opportunity. I do want to again acknowledge Professor Knoppers for all her inspiration and contributions over the years. It has truly been a privilege, a very humbling experience. Sorry Man wasn't with us. I couldn't Photoshop you in, haven't got that capability there. But thank you again, everyone. I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ho, for the wonderful presentation. So we open it up for the Q&A session. I believe everybody has access to the microphone. Please raise your hand. You'll be recognized, just like in the Senate. And then you'll have to press the button, ask your question, and then please press it again so that we don't have any issues, especially for the camera. So, and also, if we don't get a chance to have you ask the question, we have a meet and greet that will start around 11 for a whole hour, and hopefully you'll be able to ask your questions. So, any questions? Go ahead.
There you go. Calvin, first of all, what a wonderful presentation, and your ability to tie in together all these points. You were like navigating between human right, genomic, artificial intelligence, and showing how all of this ties up to Professor Knoppers' work. That was fantastic. So first of all, I do want to commend you for that, because it really takes skills to do this. So my question, and really where I'm a little bit challenged at the end, is recently, as you know, the world has been facing growing geopolitical challenges. Two things that I think about are cyber biosecurity when it comes to genomic data. And I also thought about what you mentioned, this idea of regulatory sandbox for Hong Kong. And you know that in South Korea, they have experimented with the regulatory sandbox. And the problem with that is sometimes, especially the private sector tends to abuse these sort of open spaces. And I just wanted to throw that at you and see how did you see these challenges playing out in the Hong Kong Macau sphere?
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Jolie. Really humbled by your very kind remarks. I pale in comparison to what Professor Knoppers could do. So I'm just illustrating what I've seen in the policy domain. So in thinking about this initiative, so the regulatory sandbox, for want of a better term, is just a particular enabling environment that I think could be constructed or could be developed in Hong Kong while policymakers in Hong Kong are thinking of how best to introduce a medical device regulatory regime. So the CE, the Chief Executive, has committed to the setup of this particular regime. And importantly, of course, related regulators, such as the Privacy Commissioner, has also mentioned that there will be a rethinking of the data governance space in terms of an improvement to the system itself, because it's a rather old regime that has worked well through some of the very innovations of the Privacy Commissioner and her office, but there needs to be some fundamental rethinking in terms of some of the requirements. So I thought that what is helpful, and it seems to be moving in that direction, because if you look at what the Department of Health in Hong Kong has published in recent years, a set of codes of practices and standards documents in order to support collaborative kind of functioning. It's not yet, of course, governed within a regulatory space. So the regulatory space itself is to be defined, but what you see will be the capacitation of individual actors starting at that point. It's going to be quite organic, so that, quite aside from technical capabilities, there would also be an understanding of some of the normative implications. So the normative aspect is still not yet very clear, but then what I see would be, in my view, a sort of scaling up in that direction, so that when these expectations, a bit like the ICH-GCP, when these expectations become clear at an institutional level, there would be responsible engagement, ideally, within a defined and hopefully dynamic regulatory space. So it does not mean that there will be no abuses in that system, but then I think the whole point of then having a regulatory infrastructure that's created, right, would be to have appropriate checks in place, learning from the experience of other Asian countries like in South Korea, and also developments in Europe. Of course, that's closely followed. But just to be sure, regulatory sandbox is just one particular regulatory approach. It should not be the only approach. So there would be, of course, real-world testing. This is actively being developed on mainland China. So in a number of the other provinces, so it'll be interesting to see how developments there would compare with developments in the Greater Bay Area involving Hong Kong and, of course, the province of Canton. It's a space that we're closely watching, and my hope is that with the Hong Kong Genome Institute, a similar kind of approach could be considered, one that is appropriate for genomics and in a way that could respond and be integrated in a coherent way with the different health systems that are involved. Hopefully this helps, but happy to hear your thoughts and very keen to get your guidance on this issue too. Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. Great.
Really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I'm reminded of the party game where you somebody says a phrase and then somebody adds "in bed" at the end to general amusement. Like, I like chocolate in bed, and everybody laughs. So I'm thinking of polygenic risk scores. When you add AI to the end, it sounds interesting, but what is it about polygenic risk scores that made you think that was the tag on which to attach AI? Where's the clinical utility that's currently in play in the world that would suggest that that's a major focus of attention?
Right, yeah. Thank you so much. It's an excellent question there. So I thought that the sort of applications, and do feel free to let me know your thoughts, I'll be keen, in terms of what the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Nuffield Council on Bioethics have highlighted. So they see this application as the value of this application in terms of supporting predictive abilities or capabilities within healthcare and of course personalized medicine. So in the UK, there is already the Think Kidney initiative. So of course, with the use of, in terms of predicting kidney injury, especially for individuals with diabetes, poorly controlled diabetes. So we know that if we do a biochemical test, creatinine, it could give us some lead time in responding to kidney injury. This typically would be in the form of hours. But in a pilot through the Think Kidney initiative, drawing on AI capabilities, it could give healthcare providers a lot more lead time. So the prediction of kidney failure could be a matter of days, so rather than hours. So that's a huge improvement. And of course, if you do health economic analysis, it's a huge savings as well to the health system. But it cannot be implemented at this time in a broad way because of all the various limitations that we see. And in order to respond to this limitation, there will be a need to have better data, better curated data, and better analytics analysis. So, which is why AI capability is certainly there. But the big concern is that if we just apply AI as it is, we're going to compound the problem, not to help solve it. So that followed from essentially equivalent kind of developments as we see in the US involving the veteran hospitals. And there, of course, we see a very limited data set and a lot of problems with the predictive element. So that's the sort of inspiration that came about. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just perhaps one last question. I think you had your hand raised, Ron. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk, Calvin. But I still don't understand why you feel that the background regulatory thing isn't there for polygenic risk scores, because we have other risk prediction tools, whether it's Q-risk or cancer risk prediction tools, and we have the physician who actually gives a risk based on something we don't know what's going on in here, using the hypothetical deductive method of diagnosis. We accept all this, so what's the problem with that regulatory background?
Right, yeah, thank you so much, Ron. I mean, it's a great point, but and I think that's in part one of the big struggles. So if I may just return back to the context of Hong Kong, in fact, of course, this is why I understand, not making any representations on the part of the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine. One of the biggest concerns of the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine is that, of course, Hong Kong Academy of Medicine, for those who are not familiar, it's responsible for the training and education of all specialists in Hong Kong, all specialisms, all specialties. And their big concern is that clinicians don't quite know how or what to make of AI and how to bring it to the clinic. So the capability might be technologically, it may be there. We have broad regulatory checks, but if we draw on Professor Knoppers' work, it's not good enough. It's information out there, but really doesn't give much guidance to clinicians. What exactly do they have to do? How exactly could they make good use of these sort of information in order to capacitate themselves and their patients? So it's these sort of challenges that both the Hong Kong Genome Institute and the Academy are hoping to scale up on at this particular point in time. So, and there is, one could argue, a difference in expectations. So with a strong emphasis on personalized medicine. At the same time, as you know, in terms of case law development, particularly within the common law world, there's much stronger emphasis on patient choice. And I think that is correct. So what we see would be what would be the ideal sort of situation, what would be the legal sort of requirement, but then a lack in terms of what clinicians could really do and whether health systems capacitate healthcare workers, healthcare professionals to draw on this technology and to make sensible use of it. So it's a challenge, but I do have confidence that our colleagues in Hong Kong will be able to meet this. Thanks so much, Ron.
Thank you. So we bring this session to a close, and before our meet and greet, Professor Knoppers will hand out the prize to Dr. Ho.
I'd like to thank you, Calvin, Professor Ho. I'd also like to make a comment, can't resist. Polygenic risk scores, as Yan Jolie knows, because we've had a project with Jacques Simard here in Quebec in cancer, using polygenic risk scores as a scientific strategy. And the biggest issue we found, to speak to your question, Ron, was that polygenic risk scores are just that. They're scores, they're risk levels, they're possibilities, they're probabilities. They are not a diagnosis. Very helpful for population stratification and so on, and for systems approaches to the understanding of kidney or cancer in our case in society. But they're not a diagnosis, and it's even physicians, never mind the patients, have a hard time with that. Sorry to comment on your excellent lecture. I also have two other comments. I think it was about 23 years ago that we met in Singapore. You lost a decade there somewhere, Calvin, but and I remember meeting Calvin at the first Singapore International Bioethics meeting with the late Sidney Brenner and other Thomas Murray and so on. And that sparked my interest in the contribution of the whole part of the world that I was very much, I wasn't aware of the contributions that could be made, not only from Asia at that point in time. We obviously with H3 Africa, we brought the African continent in, and how important it is to profit from the understandings and interpretations from different cultures around the world of science. And the reawakening by Professor Ho today of the Cinderella right, as I call it, the reawakening of the Cinderella right of the right to science, which includes the freedom of science, the right to participate in science, and the right of every citizen to benefit from science. And understanding science is made possible by individuals like yourself who contribute, who think ahead, who imagine, and then who participate to share their insights with everyone, students, the public, the professionals, and governments. And thank you for your work and for your excellent presentation.
Oh, okay, I've been about to open this. Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive. Oh, wow.
So thank you on behalf of McGill and the Center for your presentation today. Very honored.
No, thank you.